The first defiance. Humanity had always been overlooked. They were considered weak by the greatest minds of the galaxy, just another species in a universe filled with more powerful beings. The Galactic Council, the ruling body of the known universe, had controlled many worlds for centuries. They had grown used to seeing every species bow before them, every civilization submit to their will. But Earth was different, and it was about to prove that to the galaxy. It started with a message. The emissaries from the Galactic Council landed on Earth with the expectation that humanity would fall in line. Their ships, towering and majestic, descended into the skies above Earth cities. Across the globe, millions watched in silence as the first contact was made. The emissaries, known for their terrifying reputation, were greeted by Earth's leaders with quiet anticipation. President Leela Waters, the newly elected leader of Earth, stood before a vast crowd of diplomats and military officials. The world held its breath. Earth had been preparing for this moment for years, but no one was sure how it would play out. Would humanity submit? Would they bow like every other species? The world's leaders waited for Leela to speak, knowing that this moment would define humanity's future. When she finally spoke, her words echoed across the planet. "We will not bow," she said, her voice steady and strong. "We will not submit to you, nor to any force that thinks it can control us." The emissaries were stunned. They had expected fear, submission, or at least some form of hesitation. Instead, they were met with defiance. President Waters was not the first to speak out, but she was the first to speak with such certainty. Her words weren't just a message to the Galactic Council, they were a declaration of independence. The emissaries quickly attempted to remind her of the Council's power. They spoke of fleets, of weapons that could wipe out entire planets in an instant. They mentioned the millions of species that had already bowed before the Council, and they warned her that humanity was no different. But Leela Waters stood firm. "You can threaten us all you want, but we are not afraid. We will fight for our freedom." At that moment, the emissaries realized something. Humanity was not like the others. They were not easily intimidated, and they would not bend their knees to anyone, not even the most powerful empire in the galaxy. The news spread like wildfire. Across the world, people cheered, their hearts filled with pride. Humanity, the species that had always been overlooked, had just defied the most powerful force in the universe. It was an act of rebellion, an act of courage, and most importantly, an act of unity. For the first time, Earth was not just a planet, it was a symbol of defiance, of strength, of hope. But the Galactic Council was not about to let this insult go unpunished. The emissaries left Earth with a promise. "The full might of the Council will fall upon you." It was a threat, but it only made humanity stronger. President Leela Waters did not flinch. She knew that this was only the beginning. The Council would send their fleets, their soldiers, their most terrifying weapons, but humanity would not be broken. They had made a stand. And now, there was no turning back. The first battle was not fought in the skies, not with weapons or soldiers, but with words, and humanity had won. The Galactic Council, with all its power and might, had been defeated by a single speech. It was a victory that no one had expected, a victory that would change the course of history. Humanity's defiance had shaken the galaxy. The Galactic Council would never forget the message that Earth had sent. The fight for freedom had begun, and it would not end until humanity stood as equals among the stars. The rising rebellion.
As the smoke of the first battle began to clear, the galaxy watched in stunned silence. Humanity had done the impossible. They had beaten back the Council's fleet, and the first flickers of rebellion began to spread. For centuries, the Galactic Council had ruled with unquestioned authority, but now a new power was rising from the ashes of the conflict, Earth. News of humanity's defiance had traveled quickly across the stars. Planets once subjugated by the Council's iron grip now looked toward Earth as a symbol of hope. The powerful, oppressive force that had held the galaxy in fear was no longer the unstoppable entity it once been. Humanity, once dismissed as insignificant, had sparked a revolution. President Leela Waters became more than just Earth's leader. She became the figurehead of a galactic resistance movement. Across the universe, beings from countless worlds, oppressed for generations, began to question the Council's rule. They had long been taught that resistance was futile, that they could never defeat the Council's might. But now, Earth had shown them the way. Among these rebellious worlds was Epsilon 9, a mining colony once known for its heavy exploitation by the Council. The Epsilon 9 rebels had watched Earth's victory closely, their hopes rising with every report. Soon, they reached out to Earth, seeking assistance and joining the growing movement. The first official alliance was formed between Earth and Epsilon 9, and with it the spark of a larger rebellion. "We are no longer alone," President Waters said, addressing a global broadcast. "Earth's fight for freedom is now the galaxy's fight. Together we stand, together we will rise." But the Council was not blind to these developments. They had underestimated humanity once before, but they were not about to make the same mistake again. Supreme Commander Zar, one of the most feared generals in the Council's military, was called into action. Zar was known for his ruthless efficiency, and he had been tasked with crushing the growing rebellion. "Send a message to these rebels," Zar ordered. "We will show them the true power of the Galactic Council." Zar's plan was simple: to crush the rebellion in its infancy, before it could spread. He would take the fight directly to Epsilon 9, where the rebellion had begun to take root. The colony was small, but strategically located near an important trade route. If the Council could reclaim it, the resistance would be dealt a devastating blow. The first wave of Zar's forces arrived at Epsilon 9 with terrifying speed. Their warships, much larger than Earth's fleet, descended upon the colony like a storm. The rebels had no chance against the overwhelming firepower of the Council's ships. But what the Council didn't account for was the fierce spirit of the people of Epsilon 9. Despite being outgunned and outnumbered, they refused to surrender. "We will not bow to the Council. Not today, not ever," said Thera Dallas, a leader of the Epsilon 9 resistance, rallying her people in the face of certain destruction. Her voice was filled with defiance, her words burning like fire. As the battle raged, the people of Epsilon 9 fought back with every ounce of strength they had. Their ships, smaller but faster than the Council's behemoths, darted through the war zone, launching hit-and-run attacks, just as humanity had done during their first victory. The tactics, learned from humanity's battle with the Council, were proving effective. The Council had underestimated these rebels as well. Despite the fierce resistance, Zar's forces slowly pushed the rebels back, and Epsilon 9 was on the brink of collapse. But just as all seemed lost, the tide of the battle shifted. From the far reaches of space, a new fleet arrived, Earth's fleet, led by the Defiance. President Waters, having learned of the attack on Epsilon 9, had dispatched her best soldiers and warships to aid the rebels. The two fleets joined forces, humanity and the Epsilon 9 rebels standing side by side in their fight for survival. With Earth's reinforcements, the tide of battle turned. The Council's warships were not prepared for the combined force of two fleets. Humanity's speed, agility, and the unity of the rebellion proved to be a deadly combination. In the final moments of the battle, Commander Zar, watching the destruction of his fleet, made one last desperate attempt to turn the tide. But the rebels, led by Thera and President Waters, launched a final assault. The Defiance delivered the killing blow, and Tsar's flagship was torn apart in a flash of fire and debris. The battle was over. Epsilon 9 was saved, and with it, the rebellion had gained its first true victory. The Galactic Council had suffered another humiliating defeat, but it wasn't just a loss of ships. It was a loss of confidence. The galaxy had witnessed a turning point. The rebels were no longer scattered insurgents. They were an organized force, one that had the courage to stand up to the most powerful empire in the galaxy. Today, we didn't just win a battle. We've shown the galaxy that no force can break us, no empire can control us. This is just the beginning. The rebellion had found its strength, and with each world that joined the cause, the Galactic Council's grip on the galaxy loosened. Earth had ignited the fire of resistance, and now the flames were spreading. The rebellion was no longer just a dream. It was a reality. The final stand. The rebellion had spread like wildfire, and with each victory, the Galactic Council's once mighty empire was beginning to fracture. Planets that had long lived under the Council's thumb were now rising up, emboldened by Earth's unyielding defiance. The Council, shaken and furious, realized that they could no longer underestimate humanity. The fight was far from over, but one thing was clear: the galaxy was no longer theirs to command. The war, once thought to be mere a flash in the pan, had turned into a full-scale rebellion that threatened to consume the entire galaxy. Earth's military, having grown stronger with each victory, was now the backbone of a vast coalition of resistance forces. The leaders of the rebellion knew the time had come for a final, decisive battle, a battle that would either secure their freedom or wipe them from the stars. President Leela Waters stood before a large holographic map in the war room of the Defiance. Her expression was grim as she looked at the Council's homeworld, a planet known only as Hespera. The Council's capital was heavily fortified, protected by fleets of warships and legions of soldiers. It was the heart of their power, and if humanity was to have any chance at winning the war, they would have to take it. "This is it," Leela said, her voice steady but with the weight of responsibility. The room was silent, the weight of the moment settling on every leader in the room. They had come so far, fought so hard, but this was the ultimate test. The Council was never more dangerous, and Hespera was surrounded by the deadliest fleet humanity had ever encountered. Even with the combined strength of the rebellion, they were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing the fiercest opposition they had ever encountered. But there was no turning back now. Leela's plan was bold. They would launch a full-scale assault on Hespera, drawing the Council's fleet into a deadly trap. The Defiance would lead the charge, but they would need the support of every rebel fleet they could muster. It would be a suicide mission for many, but it was their only chance. As the fleet prepared for departure, the tension was palpable. Soldiers, engineers, and pilots alike stood ready, knowing that the coming battle could very well be their last. Earth's fleet, though strong, was far smaller than the Council's overwhelming force. But they had something the Council didn't: unity, determination, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for freedom. "Remember, this is not just about us," Leela told her fleet, addressing them over the comms. "This is for every world that has suffered under the Council's rule. This is for every species that has been crushed under their heel. We fight not just for Earth, but for the galaxy." With those words, the battle began. The journey to Hespera was long, the tension building with every light year that passed. But when they finally arrived, the sight that awaited them was enough to shake even the most seasoned of warriors. The Council's fleet, a massive armada of warships and battlecruisers, was waiting. The Council had prepared for this moment, and they would not go down without a fight. The initial clash was as brutal as it was swift. Explosions erupted in every direction, and the black void of space was lit up with the fire of battle. The Council's warships, though large and imposing, were not built for speed.
They were slow, lumbering behemoths compared to the nimble ships of Earth's fleet. Using their superior agility, Earth's forces darted around the Council's ships, launching devastating attacks on their hulls. But the Council's response was relentless. Their ships fired with precision, each blast sending shockwaves through the rebel fleet. The Defiance led the charge, its weapons tearing through enemy ships with terrifying power. But even Leela knew that the longer the battle raged, the more their chances of victory would diminish. Then, the unexpected happened. As the two fleets clashed in the dark void of space, an explosion tore through the Council's ranks. But it wasn't the result of any weapon from the Defiance. It was a surprise assault from within the Council's own ranks. A group of rebels from within the Council's military, those who had been secretly working to sabotage the Empire from within, had launched an attack on
The dawn of a new era. The sound of victory echoed throughout the galaxy as the last remnants of the Council's empire crumbled to dust. The once mighty Galactic Council, which had ruled with absolute power for centuries, was no more. Their fleets had been shattered, their homeworld reduced to rubble, and their leaders either captured or scattered across the stars. Humanity had not only survived, they had triumphed. But the victory was bittersweet. The cost had been unimaginable. Thousands of lives had been lost, countless planets left in ruins, and the rebellion soldiers carried scars, both visible and hidden, that would last a lifetime. The galaxy had been freed from tyranny, but the road to rebuilding would be long and fraught with challenges. In the aftermath of the final battle, President Leela Waters stood on the balcony of the Defiance, gazing out at the stars. The bright lights of Earth shone in the distance, a beacon of hope in the dark expanse of space. It was a sight she had once thought impossible. Earth was not just free, it had become the heart of a new order, a new way of life for every world that had suffered under the Council's boot. Leela knew that the war was over, but their real work had just begun. She was no longer just the leader of Earth. She was the leader of a galaxy that was in desperate need of healing. The rebellion had come together in the face of an overwhelming enemy, but now the task was to unite the shattered remnants of the galaxy. There were planets to rebuild, economies to stabilize, and governments to forge. The fight for freedom had been won, but the fight for peace was just beginning. The first steps were already underway. Representatives from the liberated worlds had gathered aboard the Defiance, now transformed into a symbol of unity. Species that had never before interacted, worlds that had once been bitter enemies, were coming together to form a new intergalactic council, one that would be based on equality, respect, and mutual cooperation. No longer would the galaxy be divided by the will of a single oppressive force. Now the voices of all would be heard. "It's not going to be easy," Leela said, standing before the council of new leaders. "We've won a great victory, but now we must ensure that what we've built will endure." The council's power came from division, from fear. Our power will come from unity, from the strength we find in each other. Thera Dalis, the leader of Epsilon 9, stood beside her, her face worn but resolute. "We've seen what happens when we fight together. We've seen what we can accomplish when we unite. The Council thought we were nothing, that we were weak, but we proved them wrong. Now, we must make sure the galaxy never falls under that kind of tyranny again." The new council, made up of leaders from every corner of the galaxy, began to shape the future. The process was slow, filled with disagreements and compromises. The scars of war ran deep, and not everyone was ready to forgive and forget. But the foundation had been laid, and the path forward was clear. No more would the galaxy be ruled by fear. The light of freedom had spread across the stars, and there was no turning back. On Earth, the celebrations were tempered with somber reflection. The people who had once been divided by their differences, political, social, and economic, had come together in a way they never had before. They were a unified force, not just because they had won a war, but because they had realized something essential. Freedom was not something given, it was something earned. And they had earned it through their bravery, their sacrifices, and their unbreakable will. In the years that followed, the Galactic Council's influence waned, and a new order was born. Humanity led the charge in reforming the galaxy, fostering cooperation among species that had once been bitter enemies. The rebels, now known as the Guardians of the New Order, worked tirelessly to ensure that the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. But even as peace settled over the galaxy, Leela knew that threats would always exist. There were still factions who wished to see the old ways return, and the galaxy was far from perfect. But she had learned one thing from this war. No matter the odds, no matter how insurmountable the challenge, humanity had the power to fight back. And the galaxy, united under the banner of freedom, would never again bow to tyranny. In the final moments, as Leela stood at the helm of the Defiance, looking out at the stars that had once seemed so distant and unreachable, she knew that the true battle had only just begun. It was not just about fighting the Council anymore. It was about ensuring that the galaxy would always be a place where freedom, justice, and unity could thrive. The stars were no longer a symbol of oppression. They were a symbol of hope.